At 05:15 local time, 5 solid rocket boosters lit up a frozen field in Zaporizhia Oblast and each sent a 6-ton cruise missile screaming into the sky. Their target, Kapustin Yar, Russia's premier missile test range and the facility responsible for preparing Oreshnik ballistic missiles that have been hammering Ukraine's cities for weeks. The 5 weapons you see here now, called FP-5 Flamingos, are climbing fast, heading east toward the most heavily defended airspace on the planet. Their destination was only 650 kilometers away, but the Ukrainians weren't sending the missiles where the Russians expected. The boosters burned for 6 seconds. White-hot exhaust, columns of infrared energy that every thermal sensor within 50 kilometers could see. Then they separated, tumbling into the dark below. Think of it like a bottle rocket strapped to a paper airplane. The rocket gets it off the ground, but the moment it burns out, the airplane has to fly on its own. For 1.4 seconds, nothing powered the missiles. 6 tons of fiberglass, fuel, and explosive, times 5, coasting on momentum in January air. Then the AI-25 turbofans caught. The Flamingos began descending toward their cruise altitude of 50 meters. Not there yet, still at 400 meters, decelerating through the transition from ballistic climb to low-level cruise. This is the most vulnerable phase of any cruise missile's flight. Too slow to outrun anything and too high to hide from anything. Painted in neon for every radar within the line of sight. Directly below them sat the most densely defended strip of airspace on the planet, the Russia-Ukraine contact line. Hundreds of kilometers of overlapping radar coverage. SAM batteries stacked in echelons. Crews who had been tracking Ukrainian drones and missiles for 4 years straight. But Ukraine's planners didn't send 5 Flamingos on parallel tracks like a shooting gallery. The formation spread across a 40-kilometer front, wide enough that no single Buk battery's engagement radar could track more than 1 or 2 missiles simultaneously, but close enough that the entire wave hit the contact line within the same 90-second window. Every SAM crew along the crossing axis had to pick a target and commit, and picking one meant ignoring 4. The Russian Buk-M3 battery, the SA-27, a medium-range surface-to-air system organic to infantry divisions along the front, had one of the Flamingos in its 9S-36 engagement radar, crossing target, medium altitude, boost-to-cruise transition, the exact shot the crew practiced at Ashaluk 100 times. They had roughly a 30-second window while the missile was still descending. They fired. The interceptor climbed on a converging trajectory, accelerating toward the point in space where the math said the Flamingo would be in 4 seconds. But the Flamingo was sinking faster than the prediction allowed. Every tenth of a second, it dropped closer to the ground, and every meter of descent added more clutter to the Buk's radar picture. Ground returns, smearing the fire control solution like rain on a windshield. The tracking that was clean at 400 meters turned to noise at 150. At 80, the engagement radar was fighting to hold a target that was dissolving into the terrain beneath it. Imagine trying to track a specific car on a highway from a helicopter. Easy when the road is empty, but the moment that car merges into bumper-to-bumper traffic, it disappears. That's what was happening to the Buk's radar picture. The Flamingo was merging into the ground. The interceptor passed through the formation's altitude without a hit. 50 meters above the ground, the Flamingos leveled off and pushed to 900 kilometers per hour. But the worst part was still to come. Russian air defense stacks its layers, medium range on top, short range underneath, each covering the other's blind spots. The Buk takes the first shot at altitude. Whatever survives gets handed to the goalkeeper. The Tor-M2, NATO calls it the SA-15 Gauntlet, exists for exactly this moment. While the Buk works the medium altitude problem, the Tor sits inside its coverage bubble and waits for whatever walks through. Think of it as the last defender between the striker and the goal. Its radar is optimized for the exact scenario the Buk just failed at. Fast targets hugging the ground in heavy clutter. Engagement floor, 10 meters. Reaction time from detection to launch, 5 to 8 seconds. There's no faster responding surface-to-air missile in the Russian inventory. The Tor crew had the Flamingos on radar, slow, fast, southern edge of their 16-kilometer envelope. They fired at the nearest one, exactly as Ukraine had hoped. The Tor-M2 can engage one target at a time, fire, and guide the interceptor to the computed intercept point, assess the result, and then slew to the next target and start the cycle over. Against a single cruise missile, that's more than enough. Against 5 crossing its envelope simultaneously at 900 kilometers per hour, that math is brutal. One engagement takes 8 to 12 seconds. 5 Flamingos transit the Tor's 16-kilometer window in about 20 seconds. The crew got their shot at one. The other 4 were through the envelope before the system could cycle. The interceptor's proximity fuse detonated a fragmentation ring several hundred meters in front of the targeted Flamingo's flight path. But it didn't matter. The Flamingo's airframe is fiberglass composite, not aluminum. A few shards went through it without hurting anything vital. The engagement window was now closed, and the Flamingos flew on. Every Russian radar operator behind the front row expected them to turn east towards Russia proper, joining the westward-facing threat axis that the entire Southern Military District's air defense architecture was built to counter. But the Flamingos turned south. The formation went into Rostov Oblast, then curved east, away from Kapustin Yar, away from the target, flying in the opposite direction of every cruise missile attack Ukraine had launched in nearly 4 years of war. If you pull up the map, you can see why. A straight line from Zaporizhia to Kapustin Yar runs through a gauntlet of Russia's most layered air defense corridor. S-400 batteries covering Volgograd with engagement radars reaching 400 kilometers. MiG-31 interceptors on patrol over the Astrakhan corridor. There's Zaslon radars scanning for exactly the kind of subsonic cruise missile the Flamingo is. Pol-21 GPS jamming on cell towers blanketing every populated area within the navigation denial. All of it calibrated, rehearsed, and facing due west towards the threat. Ukraine could have tried the direct route, send 5 Flamingos and accept that 3 or 4 get swatted down. That's the math. Maybe 1 or 2 get through, and 1 is enough. But that's a coin flip against a target worth a smarter play. Ukraine's planners looked at that wall and came up with something genius. Flying 1,800 kilometers to hit something 650 kilometers away sounds insane in the first place, because it's like driving from New York to Miami to get to Philadelphia. Unless every highway between New York and Philadelphia resembles the Fury Road from Mad Max, then Miami starts looking better. But the long route created a problem Ukraine couldn't engineer away. These engines belong on training jets. Motorseek built them decades ago in Zaporizhia to power the Aero L-39 Albatross, a Czech trainer that student pilots flew on supervised solos, 2-hour flights, full ground crews between every sortie. Firepoint, the Ukrainian startup company that builds the Flamingo, bought thousands of these from scrap yards. Old Soviet metal, refurbished, bolted onto cruise missiles, and told to do something no L-39 instructor ever imagined those engines could do. Each engine has maybe 10 hours of life left. Tonight, they need less than 2. But those 2 hours will be the hardest flying these turbofans have ever done. The direct flight is 43 minutes. The southern arc pushes toward 2 hours. And every additional minute is a minute those refurbished engines have to keep running at 50 meters in sub-zero air. Commercial jets have anti-icing systems, heated intakes with air routed to critical surfaces. Redundant backups tested 10,000 times in controlled conditions. The AI-25 has none of that. At 50 meters altitude in freezing conditions, these engines are gulping dense, moisture-laden air at enormous volume. That moisture crystallizes on intake surfaces and compressor blades, disrupting airflow until the compressor stalls. A stall at 50 meters turns a cruise missile into a 6-ton lawn dart. Ground impact in under 4 seconds. The engines that student pilots once trusted on supervised solos were now the single point of failure on 5 weapons that took months to plan. And the clever route that dodged every Russian SAM had doubled the window in which the Flamingo's own machinery could down them. And if the cold weather were a bump in the road, then this next issue is a giant sinkhole they have to drive around. Next came Kalmykia, one of the emptiest landscapes in Europe. Buddhist steppes stretching to every horizon. Almost no population. Practically zero infrastructure. The kind of place where satellite imagery is one shade of brown for 300 kilometers in every direction. The Flamingos crossed it in near total electromagnetic silence. And for the first time since launch, the anti-jam antenna arrays pulled clean GPS fixes and corrected whatever navigational drift accumulated during the frontline crossing. No cell towers meant no Pol-21 GPS jamming. For once, emptiness was an ally. But emptiness cuts both ways. The backup terrain contour matching, or TERCOM navigation, which reads the ground with a radar altimeter and matches it against a stored terrain map, needs features to reference. Ridges, river bends, elevation changes. Kalmykia has none of it. If GPS dropped here, satellite fault, onboard failure, anything, the missiles would have no way to know where they were. They would fly straight until the fuel ran out and crater in fields nobody would search for months. 5 navigation threads stretched thin across a landscape that offered 0 second chances. Thankfully, the Flamingos cleared Kalmykia and turned north toward the Caspian coast, toward Kapustin Yar, and right into the one thing the long route couldn't avoid. The western Caspian coastline is not empty. The Russian Caspian flotilla patrols these waters out of Makhachkala and Astrakhan, and on this morning, a Buk-M3 class corvette was doing exactly that. Weighing in at 950 tons, they're tiny for a warship, but these corvettes have positive ME air search radars, and over open water, that radar has a cheat code that no amount of composite construction can beat. Over land, a low-flying missile's radar return gets tangled with terrain, buildings, power lines, noise the Flamingos can hide in. Over water, the picture is clean. Anything airborne shows up against a blank background like a flashlight in a dark room. The ship's Combat Information Center registered contacts, low altitude, high subsonic, heading north. The Buk-M3 carried an AK-630 rotary cannon and Igla shoulder-launched missiles for self-defense, but the Flamingos were too far and too fast to engage. By the time a gunner trained the AK-630 on the bearing, they would be gone. The captain picked up the radio instead. Contact report, bearing, speed, altitude, heading. Transmitted to Caspian Flotilla headquarters in Astrakhan. 1,800 kilometers of route planning, every radar avoided, every SAM sidestep, just got compromised by a ship on a routine patrol that happened to look at the right screen at the wrong moment. Flotilla HQ relayed the report to the Regional Air Defense Command, and here the intercept chain hit a wall that bought the Flamingos their lives, at least for the moment. Cruise missile contacts from the south didn't match a single threat template in the system. Every scramble procedure and standing order in the Southern Military District was oriented west. Fast movers heading north from the Caspian weren't in anyone's playbook. The duty officer needed verification. Friendly? Commercial? Flotilla aircraft returning to base? The contact perimeters screamed cruise missiles, but from that bearing, it cost extra minutes to classify. Not many, but enough. At Aktubinsk, the 929th State Flight Test Center adjacent to Kapustin Yar, a MiG-31 Foxhound crew received the scramble order. The MiG-31 does Mach 2.35, fastest combat aircraft in operational service on Earth. Its Zaslon AM is the most powerful radar in Russian service, tracks 10 targets, engages 4 simultaneously. This aircraft was designed from the fuselage up to intercept cruise missiles. If you build a machine specifically to hunt down and swat a Flamingo out of the sky, you'd end up with something that looks a lot like the MiG-31. And right now, one crew is sprinting across the tarmac toward theirs. But none of this happens instantaneously. The MiG-31's D-30 F6 turbofans need 90 seconds from cold start to stable idle. 90 seconds while Flamingos are covering at 15 kilometers per minute. Main engine spooling. Afterburner kicked in and 25,000 kilograms of thrust pinned both crew to their seats. Gear up. 90 kilometers. Climbing through the cold January sky over Astrakhan. Nose pitched toward the dark southern horizon. 80 kilometers. The Zaslon needed warm-up calibration before it could scan. The phased array has to stabilize or the first few sweeps produce garbage returns. 70 now. The Wizzo in the rear cockpit activated the radar. Ground control passed the bearing from the ship's report. Data already minutes old. But here was the deeper problem. The Flamingos had maintained their lateral spread from the contact line through the entire southern route. By now, approaching from the south, they were converging on the target complex from slightly different bearings, spread across 30 kilometers of front. The Zaslon's beam sweeps a 140-degree cone, but each swap catches whatever's in its path at that instant. A missile 15 kilometers left to the beam center doesn't exist until the antenna sweeps back to that bearing. 5 missiles spread across 30 kilometers meant the radar was effectively searching 5 separate haystacks one at a time. The pilot pointed south and the Zaslon began sweeping. Clutter, ground returns, a January temperature inversion over the steppe bending radar energy in unpredictable ways, ghost returns and shadow zones in exactly the altitude band where the Flamingos were flying. The Wizzo narrowed the elevation scan. The Zaslon's published detection range against a low-altitude cruise missile is 65 kilometers. That number comes from Ashuluk, under test conditions with a cooperative target on a known heading. Against unannounced contacts from the wrong direction over dark steppe, effective range drops. How far depends on everything the textbook doesn't cover. 60 kilometers to Kapustin Yar. Then the MiG got lucky. A return. Faint. Bearing 175. Range uncertain. The Wizzo tried to promote it from a search hit to a track. The system needed several consecutive returns at consistent bearing and range to build a firing solution. 2 sweeps. Then nothing. The only meaningful radar reflections on a 12-meter fiberglass cruise missile are the metal engine nacelle and the control surfaces. From certain aspects, the Zaslon was hunting returns roughly the size of motorcycles. 45 kilometers. Down went the nose. Lower altitude reduces clutter but shrinks the radar horizon. One problem traded for another. The Wizzo cycled modes. Track while scan. Single target track. Wide search. Panzer batteries around Kapustin Yar had rotated south based on the ship report. Everyone was looking across a 30-kilometer arc. Nobody had a lock. 35 kilometers. Solid return now. 3 consecutive sweeps. Constant bearing, decreasing range. The Wizzo commanded lock on. The Zaslon transitioned from search to single target track. For the first time since launch, a Russian weapon system had a Flamingo in a firing solution. 1 Flamingo out of 5. The pilot selected the R-37M, Mach 6, the longest-ranged air-to-air missile in Russian operational service. At this distance, roughly 15 seconds to intercept. The Flamingos needed about 100 seconds to reach the target. The math should have been more than enough to swat all 5, if the crew could find all 5. He fired at the one he had. The R-37 dropped off the rail and the booster slammed it to 6 times the speed of sound in under 3 seconds, steering toward the computed intercept point, the spot in space where the R-37's trajectory and its target's trajectory would converge. The intercept points are predictions. They assume the target holds its current speed and heading. The targeted Flamingo was entering its terminal phase, a slight climb, a final course correction, 2 degrees, maybe 3, as the navigation system made its last refinement toward the target site coordinates, negligible for warhead accuracy, enough to ship the intercept point by hundreds of meters at this closure rate. The R-37 reached the computed coordinates. The Flamingo was now 400 meters past them, and behind it, 4 more were seconds from impact. 4 missiles the MiG never had a chance to engage. Then, at 07:17 local time, the first Flamingo pitched into its terminal dive. The warhead, an 1,150-kilogram penetrating charge, the same class as a Blue 109 bunker buster, punched through the roof of a hangar-type building used for Oreshnik pre-launch preparation. It didn't detonate on contact. It was designed to keep going. Through the roof, through the floor, into the infrastructure underneath. And then it detonated. The blast wave ripped outward through the structure from the inside, blowing walls off their foundations, collapsing the ceiling inward, and everything in the building turned into shrapnel. 4 more impacts followed within seconds. The hangars where Russian crews had spent weeks preparing Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missiles for launch were tore open from below. Assembly infrastructure, logistics warehouses, servicing equipment, shredded by weapons that cost less than Moscow apartments, powered by junkyard engines, assembled by a startup founded by architects and game designers. Bye for now.